Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Get Out of Jail Free Radio Hour. I am your host and guide, Mr. Crispy, speaking to you through uncanny frequencies and sharing with you stories strange, fascinating, and terrifying. The views and opinions expressed on air are solely those of the speaker. The Get Out of Jail Free Radio Hour is an entertainment program, and any similarities to any person living or dead, or any place or events, are entirely coincidental. The Get Out of Jail Free Radio Hour was created except as indicated by Matt Henshaw. Listener discretion is advised. And now, take Mr. Crispy's moldering hand in yours, ignore that tacky fluid under my nails, and join me for the Get Out of Jail Free Radio Hour. In the summertime. The sound in the night air was like that incessant jug blowing, ch-ch, ch-ch, and it awakened Jerry from his slumber with a start. Sheets stained with sweat, he turned over muttering to himself. Summertime was always the worst time, even when he tried to subsume his fears in women and wine. He shut his eyes tighter, willing the sound to fade away. He could feel the warmth to his left of Delilah, his latest conquest. Her hair smelled of the cheap marijuana they both partook of before stripping naked, high as the sky and making love. His stomach rumbled, and he could feel the cheap wine bubbling up, not quite to vomit, but the burning acid of heartburn. He belched and rolled out of bed, staggering to the bathroom to empty his bladder. As he relieved himself, he noticed a shadow move unexpectedly against the wall, a subtle shift of the light. His stream stopped as his heart raced. Not again, he thought with dread. Against the floor of the bedroom he heard the telltale clack of claws making their way to the bed. He shrank into the shadows of the space behind the bathroom door, holding his breath as he peered out of the crack. His eyes went wide in terror as he saw the unnatural shape of the Mungo. The Mungo stood on 4 hairy legs with 2 sets of joints that bent them at right angles. They ended in paws with 3 talons. The Mungo's torso was bare skin, mottled with livid spots which could be due to age or self-injury. The arms were muscular trunks, easily twice the circumference of its legs. It would be nothing for the Mungo to lift a ton, or even a ton and 25. Upon its neck sat 2 sets of jaws, sporting 3 rows of sharp, jagged teeth. A line of drool dripped hissing to the floor. Its red eyes were sunken into its skull, having no problem seeing in the early morning gloom. A bony ridge suggestive of vertebrae stood like a mohawk on top of its head. Jerry was frozen, terrified as he gazed at the slathering beast grabbing Delilah. The Mungo made quick work popping her head off with only the briefest of screams. Now the vomit did come up as the Mungo slurped the brains out of Delilah's skull. Standing in his hot sick, Jerry struggled to stay still and silent so as not to get the Mungo's attention and meet the same fate. The Mungo continued its gory feast, licking up the viscera as though it were melting ice cream. Even though it was the summertime, steam rose from the bed which now served as Mungo's buffet. The sounds of bones cracking and skins slapping wet on the floor made a shuffling kind of rhythm. Jerry's breaths came in short bursts. Jerry couldn't tell how much time had passed before he heard a motorcycle driving down the street. The Mungo, hearing the sound, leapt away like a leopard, smashing through a window to the street below. After several more minutes, Jerry crept out of his hiding spot, tracking puke behind him, and cried, shuddering at the violent aftermath of the Mungo's meal. As he began to black out, he reflected upon how much he hated living in the summertime. And now, missives from denizens of the zodiacal spaces. The diadem of 1,000 eyes. With my 457th eye, I spy a woman-child of 7 or 8 years standing in a market square, looking covetously at a tunic of sapphire blue. She asks the wearer if she may have a swatch, and the individual consents. At home, the woman-child affixes the fabric to the wall, where she sees it every morning while dressing. The texture and color indelibly imprint themselves on her young mind, and she is troubled by dreams uncanny and disturbing. As she ages, she becomes a politician who casts a deciding vote in favor of space exploration. Hundreds of years later, long after she has passed away, humanity encounters extraterrestrial life in the form of plankton growing under the seas of HJ 398, an otherwise unremarkable planet in an otherwise unremarkable galaxy. The plankton is the same color and texture as the swatch of fabric. Sisters Weird. Donna, the younger, plays cat's cradle with a skein of thread spun by a carpenter worm. It takes the shape of a fifth-dimensional hemicube, representing the rise and rule of the Jinklo Omnicrest in the coming 200 years. Meanwhile, Gabby the Elder continues writing the book which will be known in 21st century European literature as a game changer for its portmanteau style combining French and Czech language. I, Sally, the middle child and the one who speaks, can reveal that Jonathan Polk is the serial killer who has stumped New Orleans detectives for 15 years, having brutally slaughtered a dozen prostitutes. Upon his arrest, Mr. Polk will confess to the killings and lead investigators to the sites where he disposed of the bodies. Miss Frances Boulogne will be cited by the city for solving the case and bringing Jonathan to justice. He will be sentenced to death by lethal injection, which will be the last state execution performed before capital punishment is abolished in the United Federation of Sino-Brazilian States. Trouble looked askance at the milling crowds of the square, taking aim. Words in verse. Cleave. Alone I stalk this barren land, cowl wool itching my weary arms, hood over my scabbard and fevered head. My tongue runs over the empty socket, where Legion plucked the incisor out of my skull before I smote them with my cudgel. Adorned with 17 nails, blessed with holy water, as it is written. Flesh matter caked in places on the black wood. I see them all, shimmer wavering, wrong faces like masks over the possessed, their eyes wild with madness, a fire over the ashy tinder of their still, subdued human minds. They cry out pleas of mercy, but I hear the harsh, sniggering undertones, mocking my work, my purpose. They say they'll only pass into another more innocent host, to make my work, my purpose, even more taxing on my eternal soul. But I will do my job still with the help of until it is finally done. And now, Fiction Corner. My feet felt like wet bags of null cement, and I collapsed on my chair in an exhausted heap. With my quickened heartbeat, I could feel that pulse through my hands, arms, and legs. Steam rose from my head, tendrils resembling pipe smoke. I turned my left arm and peeled back the skin. Circuits blinked, calculating the damage that was done. Radiation at an unsafe level. It was to be expected in this oblast. I sighed and covered the ports back up again. My right palm itched, the eye there conjunctive and tearing up. I went through the end table drawer and found the small bottle of ointment. Carefully, I dropped some of the medicine into the orb, twitching as it made contact. My shirt clung to me with a combination of sweat and the sloughing of pseudodermis from the irradiated venture out to the zone. I removed the shirt with a sticky sound, accompanied by the chemical smell of the pseudodermis. Sores in the shape of spirals were getting scabbed over. It would be a challenge of discipline not to itch and pick at them. I swiveled and turned the mahogany knobs that served as nipple ports. This is more of a nervous tic than anything else, and the pleasure has everything to do with the sound of the wooden threaded shank against the monocarbonate chest plate. The casing had long ago become stripped, so the knob just spun and spun. Completing that bit of obsessive-compulsive behavior, I set to undoing the straps which attached my lower leg prostheses to my upper thighs. The straps were rare, real leather, buckled with an aluminum alloy which was tarnished with rust. The lower leg prosthetics were still the most efficient and covert way to transport the goods from the valley zone back to the city. The Sharif Council still assumed that smugglers carried their illicit traffic on their person, but not within, and the prosthetics were of a good enough quality that they eluded deeper investigation by the checkpoint workers. I unscrewed one at a time from their sockets, as I would a thermos, and looked inside. Of course, some were damaged, the fruits I acquired from the valley zone. They had the appearance of what at one time were called strawberries, except they were grown in clusters and had raised orbs all over them like tumors. All told, between both legs, I had about 3 pints. There were enough for myself for the coming month, and then more that I could sell on the submarket. They certainly weren't the most forbidden or sought-after goods from the valley zone. That would be the mantis extract ou pleographane, which even I was not willing to risk a long prison stint for. But still, these berries, called by the locals Guelin Honpos, had their risk. The berries were, first off, delicious and made the government gruel we were allotted way more palatable. They also had a slight hallucinatory effect, where time would seem to accelerate while performing tedious tasks. This made the work a good chunk of the citizenry was involved in way more tolerable. The side effects, as reported by the Health Council, were mania, moral degradation, and an inability to say "Vajak." Much like the cliques I frequent, I take what the Health Council says with a grain of salt, after the corruption of the previous administration was exposed. But still, I can't deny that I have no compunctions about performing these little illegal runs from time to time, and that for 12 to 48 cycles after consuming the berries I ride a kind of high that makes walking down the drab sidewalks of the city an exhilarating rush. I never use the word "vajak" in my daily life anyways, so I couldn't say for sure whether that happens. Typically, it is only used during religious rituals, and I am in the minority as far as my atheism and aversion to ritual goes. I licked the juice off my fingers, tangy and sweet, with an umami richness, and set about divvying up the fruit into mine and the submarkets. Thus divided, I strapped back on my fake limbs, gathered my wares, and proceeded down to the submarket for the day's sales. Strabismus by Stefan Grabinski. He had attached himself to me, I don't know how or when. His name was Bressois, Joseph Bressois. What a name! Something about it fastens and hooks onto the nerves, irritating them with its grating resonance. He was cross-eyed. He especially saw poorly out of his right eye, which peered out in a stone gaze under ruddy lashes. His small brick-colored face grimaced perpetually in a malicious sneer of half-irony, as if in this sorry way it could avenge its own ugliness and squalor. A tiny rusty mustache, twirled rakishly upward, moved constantly, like the pincers of a poisonous Scarabeus, sharp, stinging, evil. A horrible man. He was agile, elastic as a ball, slender-figured, of medium build. He walked with a light, elusive step and could slip into a room without being noticed. I couldn't stand him from the first time I saw him, and felt an indescribable disgust whenever I looked at him, particularly as his physical features suited his character. This person was extremely different from me in his disposition, tastes, and behavior. That is why I felt such a strong antipathy towards him. He was my living antithesis, with whom there could be no reconciliation. Maybe precisely because of this, he latched himself onto me with a rabid passion, as if sensing my natural aversion toward him. He probably experienced particular delight in seeing how unsuccessfully I tried to extricate myself from the nets he was always ensnaring me with. He was my inseparable companion in cafes, on walks, at the club. He knew how to worm his way into the circles of my nearest acquaintances. What's more, he could conquer the favor of women to whom I was closely connected. He knew of my smallest plans, my slightest movements. More than once, so as to be free of looking at his loathsome physiognomy for even just a single day, I would escape unseen by carriage or automobile to the outskirts of town, or else, with no prior word betraying my intention, I would set out for another locality. How can I describe my amazement when, after a while, Brescia would suddenly spring up, as if from under the ground, saying with a sneering, sweet smile how happy he was at our unexpected, pleasant meeting. It finally reached the point where his presence inspired a superstitious fear in me, and I considered him my evil spirit or demon. His annoying cat-like movements, the cunning narrowing of his eyes, and most of all his strabismus, with the cold glossiness of the scleras, curdled my blood with inconceivable dread, while simultaneously stirring up boundless rage. And he knew perfectly well the easiest way to infuriate me. He was always able to agitate my most sensitive nerves. As soon as he had discovered my tastes in what I held important, he took every opportunity to deride them so savagely that it seemed he wanted to exclude any opposition. One point of contention fundamentally separating us was the question of individualism, which I always defended with ardent passion. I have a feeling that around this very axis revolved our entire antagonism. I was a staunch admirer of everything personal, original, unique, self-contained. Brescia, to the contrary, scoffed at every kind of individualism, considering it a chimera of presumptuous fools. Hence, he didn't believe in any inventiveness or ingeniousness, reducing them to the influences of environment, race, the, quote, spirit of the times, and so on. I even believe he would drawl more than once, crisscrossing his eyes in my direction, that each of us contains several individuals who fight for that worthless scrap, the so-called soul. The obvious banter was meant to elicit a passionate reaction on my part. Realizing this, I would pretend that I hadn't heard anything and ignore him. Then he would be on the lookout for another opportunity to pronounce his collective position, as he termed it. Whenever I displayed admiration and rapture for some new work of art or scientific invention, Brescia, with cynical calm, would attempt to prove the groundlessness of my adoration, or else he would silently sit opposite me and transfix me with his frightful strabismus, a smile of malicious sarcasm never leaving his lips. He didn't feel any aesthetic thrills at all. Beauty didn't act upon him in any sense of the word. Instead, he was a sports enthusiast. There wasn't an automobile race, a cycling competition, or soccer match in which he didn't shine. He fenced like a master, was a great shot, and had the reputation of being a first-class swimmer. Education and scholars be ignored, holding to the maximum that nihil novi sub sole. Despite this, one couldn't deny his great intelligence, which showed itself in witty and vitriolic sayings. Of a hot-headed nature, he was unable to endure opposition, and had continual rows in countless affairs of honor, from which he always emerged successful. A strange thing, however, he was never offended by anything I said, however uncivil or insulting my words. I alone had the privilege of insulting him. Apparently, he saw this as my due for his never-ending sneering and pestering. Perhaps there was another reason, but what, I don't know. Sometimes I would intentionally exaggerate to goad him into a serious quarrel that would end our relationship, a fruitless activity. Sensing what was happening, he would dismiss my moral condemnation with his very sweet smile and turn everything into a joke. Finally, I got rid of him. An event occurred that seemed once and for all to liberate me from his clutches. He died a sudden, violent death, and I was the indirect cause. One day, at the end of my tether, I struck him in the face. Brescia instantly bridled. He turned white as a sheet, and then I caught sight of a steely flash in his eyes that I had never seen before. He quickly hid his anger, however, and laid a shaking hand on my shoulder. "You got unnecessarily carried away," he said with a tremulous voice. "It's to no avail. Neither you nor I are capable of offending the other. You see, my dear sir, it is exactly as if someone wanted to slap his own face. Both of us really are one." "Bastard," I muttered through my teeth. "As you please, this will not change a thing." And his eyes began to crisscross like crazy. The row had, nevertheless, a serious tragic consequence for him. Since everything had occurred in the presence of several witnesses, people found out about the incident, and from then on, no one granted him the freedom to do as he pleased. Brescia flew into rages, arranged scandalous practical jokes, and eventually forced one of his greatest enemies to an encounter with revolvers. Even though my argument with him had set up the basis for such an event, Brescia asked me to be his second. I refused, and though I didn't care for Brescia's opponent, I offered my services to him. I did this intentionally, pleased that, at least obliquely, I could do away with my persecutor. My offer was accepted, and the duel, under very strict conditions, took place in a grove on the outskirts of the city. Brescia fell, shot in the forehead. I remember his last glance. It was directed at me, a piercing look that paralyzed the will. Immediately afterwards he ceased breathing. I left, not daring to look any longer at that demonic, twisted face. But that face will never disappear from my memory. It is deeply etched there in indelible lines, and that terrible Strabismus will eternally gash my soul with its cross-eyed stare. Brescia's death, particularly the last painful moments of his life, upset me so strongly that shortly afterwards I came down with a severe brain fever. The illness dragged on for months and months, and when, thanks to the untiring help of doctors and amid constant anxiety about a relapse, I finally got well, I was unrecognizable. My character was completely altered. It seemed alien and even antagonistic to the person I had been before. My former tastes, my noble fervor for everything beautiful and profound, my refined faculty for perceiving a flicker of originality were now gone. There only remained an enigmatic detail, the memory that I had once possessed these virtues. I became a practical person, healthy, normal to the point of nausea, an enemy of any type of eccentricity, and the most painful thing for me, I started to sneer at my former ideals. My every word and gesture was clothed in sarcasm or malicious laughter. Everything I did seemed false. Aware of these new changes within me, I attempted to somehow resist. So I began a fierce struggle between the two different selves, of whose coexistence I was deeply convinced. But the new self always prevailed, and despite my inner loathing, I always listened to his promptings. It was like the difference between theory and practice. In my principles, I remained the same as always, and with indignation watched the actions of the other me, who had like a thief slipped into my innermost core and was getting rid of what had been my essence, replacing it with his vileness. And I wouldn't describe my condition as the commonly known split personality, for what had occurred was a completely different matter that could not be psychologically explained by the first half of my life. I felt that one couldn't speak of a splitting of oneself, rather of a doubling up. It was as if some diabolic intruder had moved in. I carried him within, continually wounding myself with this horrid coexistence, powerless, despairing over the awareness of a change I couldn't dismiss. Each one of my deeds aroused an inner opposition and represented itself as a will imposed on me from outside. Each word was a lie, unsupported by conviction, devoid of the strength of feelings. Worse still, the intruder encroached into the domain of my thoughts and beliefs, trying to reshape me completely in his own image. Whenever I wanted to behave in a manner consistent with my former attitude toward the world, some strong force from within me would compel me to the new, unbearable path, and I would hear a snigger inside me and see in my mind's eye a devilish strabismus. I detested myself both physically and morally. I couldn't stand my own being because it seemed disgusting, grotesque. So as to reduce the antics of the new I to a tolerable minimum, I shut myself up at home for days on end and avoided people, in whose eyes I saw both amazement and aversion. Here in my quiet abode, in a secluded corner of the city, I passed long hours of torment, struggling with my hidden enemy. Here within 4 silent walls, I spent long moments thinking about my internal agony. In due course in my struggle with the intruder, I achieved a certain skill in excluding him, at least for a brief time, from the process of my thinking. Total isolation, freedom from the hustle and bustle allowed me, even if only for a couple of minutes, to focus my attention on my real former self and liberate it from the brutal iron hand of the usurper. These were truly great efforts. I had the impression of a person who, with titanic strength, separates 2 heavy half-globes and succeeds in keeping them apart for a few moments. Then, taking advantage of such occasions, I threw myself into my writing and filled up page after page with the thoughts that had been seething inside me, but which couldn't find an outlet, for they had been suppressed by my other self. With bated breath, I wrote like a madman, driving my hand across the paper to express what I thought and felt, to state before the world that I am not the person I will appear to be in an hour or a few minutes' time. But this frantic effort never lasted long. All that was needed was a shout from the street, the entrance of a servant into the room, or the sight of a passerby's face, and my tense nerves would split like cords, my taut muscles would snap with a dull crack, and the obstinate half-globes would press together to form a hermetically sealed uniform sphere. A horrible cynical laugh would issue from my lips, and sobbing with anguish, I would thoroughly destroy whatever I had written. And once again, I'd return to the outside world, disgracefully changed to a base, sneering individual without any values and beliefs. And once again, long exertions of thought would be necessary, withdrawal from the world in absolute solitude, so that I could, even if only for a couple of minutes, isolate myself from the incursions of the hateful being and exclude him from my soul. Yet, in repeating these experiences, I achieved increasingly encouraging results. For longer periods, I was able to hold myself apart from the alien intruder and to cleanse myself of his filth. Afterwards, of course, everything reverted to the previous state, but the memory of these short liberations stimulated further attempts. Eventually, I became myself for a couple of hours, and I took advantage of this in the best possible manner, hurrying before my enemy would return. But constant observation and guarding of oneself at every step, a necessity for this mutual electrolysis of the doubled I, wearied me extremely, making me nervous and leaving me with violent headaches. Nevertheless, having acquired a dim hope of reclaiming my true being, I didn't spare myself and already dreamt of the moment I could freely appear as my own person in company. One day, after a longer stay in the world, I shut myself in for a specific aim and undertook the arduous work of separation. As a result of practice, this task was easier, and I soon inhabited my own being again. I turned my attention to my immediate physical surroundings so that, under this new condition, I could get accustomed to maintaining a measure of control over my individuality, eventually doing so in the face of the 100-fold stronger distractions of the world. As I was slowly moving away from self-concentration and absent-mindedly glancing about the room, I thought I heard some noise beyond the left wall. Curious, I began to listen, but this directed me too strongly to the outside, bringing about the fatal merging of barely separated elements, and again I stopped being myself. Broken-hearted, I cursed the suspicious noise, which anyway might only have been an illusion of wandering thoughts caused by nervous tension. Thus my first attempt at reclaiming myself while being attentive to my surroundings proved abortive. Nevertheless, I didn't lose hope, and a couple of days later I conducted a test. As long as I was preoccupied with myself, I didn't hear anything suspicious beyond the wall. But as soon as I started to pay more attention to my surroundings, I heard that same mysterious noise coming from the left side. Even though I knew perfectly well that as a consequence I would lose myself and return to that loathsome double existence, I immediately thrust my head out of the window and glanced to the left with the hope of discovering the cause of the noise. The house I lived in had one story and consisted of 3 sections. I occupied the end wing, so that beyond me on the left side there were no more rooms, and the outer wall faced a small enclosed garden. As usual at that time, no one was in it. Generally, no one came up on my side, respecting my privacy and discreetly avoiding the line of my windows. Uneasy, I drew my head back inside. It occurred to me that perhaps the puzzling noise had been accompanying the cleaning process for the self for some time, very likely taken up with intense internal work and projecting it onto paper. I hadn't noticed what had been happening around me. Only when I had pulled back a certain distance from my newly crystallized individuality and turned my attention to my surroundings had I been able to detect these mysterious sounds. Though I wasn't sure why this was happening during my attempts at spiritual emancipation, I eventually had to admit to a connection, because the noise made itself heard only when I succeeded in casting off my hateful fetters. Frequently, when I was in my usual double state, I would listen for something to reach me from that side, but to no avail. The wall at those times didn't let through the slightest tremor. Sometimes I thought I was succumbing to an acoustic illusion, and that the noise was in reality coming from the right wall, behind which lived a quiet bachelor. But this speculation was rejected after scrupulous evaluation of the sounds. Therefore, the noise was coming only from beyond the left wall, beyond a wall that bordered on empty space. Most strange. After a while, when the sounds persisted, I began to carefully examine the left wall. Soon I came to the opinion that there was a cavity inside, because when I banged it, the wall emitted a hollow reverberation. This assumption was subsequently strengthened by a detail observed on the outside of the house. Scrutinizing attentively the left wing, I noticed for the first time with no little surprise that the distance between the boundary of the wall and the last window amounted to 4 meters. Since the wall on the inside was separated from the window by at most a meter, then its thickness was 3 meters, an unusual dimension for a house of this sort. Beyond me, then, was a walled-up room, and that particular noise originated from it. This was obvious. Amazed at this discovery, for a long time I practically never left my home, spending hours on end in trying to reach my true self. Now, however, this proved to be more difficult because, catching sounds from the void, I diverted my attention too quickly from my own being. Realizing that by this road I wouldn't attain my goal, I concentrated my entire energy on thinking of myself, and only when I felt the strong intensity of my regained individuality did I listen to those sounds which emanated from the hidden room. After a while, I noticed they contained rather audible semitones, like gradations. The deeper I would sink into the process of my spiritual liberation, and the more I would purge myself of my other self, the more distinctly the noise would make itself heard. Something restless was tramping inside that enclosed space, roaming about the corners, wandering along the length of the walls as if in frantic helplessness. But when I was trapped again in that unhappy double state, More strongly restrained by the co-presence of the alien element, the sounds beyond the wall calmed down and faded away as if soothed. There was something puzzling about this, something that stimulated my utmost curiosity while evoking ice-cold fear. One had the impression that while I was out here dealing with my hated enemy, endeavoring to oust him from my unfortunate ego, there beyond the wall some entity was being born. Something was being formed, was emerging. Finally, I decided to smash down the wall and see what was inside that hidden room. It was appropriate, however, to proceed systematically and slowly, so as not to scare away the strange being. Whenever I listened at length to the particular details of its movements, everything ceased, and I, a thing for me incomprehensible, would burst out with devilish laughter and return to my double state. "This is some cunning beast," I muttered, quietening down after these unexpected outbursts. "However, we will find even for this a remedy. We will find it, and it will be infallible. One has to catch you off guard." I soon proceeded with my plan. I took a piece of chalk and drew on the wall a quadrangle corresponding more or less to my size. Then I chipped off the plaster within the marked boundaries, after which I carefully cut out with a sharp tool the inside section of the wall, leaving only a thin layer, which, according to my estimate, would give way with one blow. After finishing these preparations during the day, I decided to break into the room that very evening and catch whatever had been unsettling me for many weeks. Outside, the autumn weather was typically foul. A light rain fell continually. An early dusk unreeled gray lines of curled mist along narrow suburban back streets. From sparsely scattered lanterns spread out golden flickering trails, dying in the distended watery expanse. Some kind of carts, wet, slippery, dragged along the road in a clattering file. I lowered the blind and lit a lamp. I felt strange and not myself. I dropped my weary head onto my hands and sank into the work of liberation. As usual, I reminded myself of my former character, its development and its tastes. I immersed myself in drawing out my experiences before my illness. I imagined myself in typical situations in which my individuality had manifested itself most clearly. Thus I went further and further, going down ever deeper to reach the most primary layers of my ego. I was happy. I was that former self, full of belief and confidence in the future, infused with the love of goodness and beauty, fascinated by life and its secret wonders. I was at the peak of my emancipation, without a particle of alien matter, with the cleanest ego. Suddenly I looked around, taking in the room with a quick glance. At that moment a noise to my left pierced my solitude. Something was hurling itself around beyond the wall, as if from the floor to the ceiling, scraping along the walls in despair, rolling around in painful fits, without finding a way out. I listened with bated breath, clutching a pick in my hand. After several minutes the noise quieted down. Fretful, nervous steps followed. Someone, clearly of this world, was pacing up and down in that hidden room, from corner to corner. I raised the pick and with all my strength hit the marked wall. I rushed inside, and at that moment came a deadly silence. I was hit with the stifling, putrid odor of a sealed space. At first, stunned by the blinding darkness, I saw nothing. But a long streak of light from my lamp slipped into the void after me, and it crept along the floor to the corner. I looked there and let go of the pick, horror-struck. At the corner of the little room, squeezed between two walls, crouched some human figure, staring at me with a piercing greenish look. Drawn by the magnetic power of his gaze, I advanced. The figure straightened up, grew. I cried out. It was Breshwa. He stood silent and still, only his mustache twitched slightly. Suddenly he inclined himself in my direction, leaned against my chest, and entered me. vanishing inside without a trace. Dazed, like an automaton, I went and grabbed the lamp from the table and rushed back through the breach. In vain. The room was empty. Under the ceiling swung cobwebs. Along the walls trickled cold tears of humidity. Suddenly a sound cut the air, hoarse, whizzing, grating. "What's that? What's that?" Then I realized it was my laughter. In the fields, up for grabs. This beast who prefers to be called Sam, the result of intensive grafting and crossbreeding between sapien and capra, Sam combines the best of both species, suited to work in and around the home and toilet trained. Standout features include rippling haunches and biceps, able to slink into tight spaces, and psychic talents to liven up an evening soiree. Behind his eyes lies a deep intelligence of tax law, making him an excellent bookkeeper. Inquiries may be made for his retainment via post to the Field Corporation. Please address "Attention, Sam for let" in the body of the request. First come, first served. Lease terms of 30 days minimum, maximum of 120 days. No refunds offered. And now from Old Wyethscope's quarterly concern, dates of import. March 18th, Conflagration Day. Gather the family round the pit, and rejoice, for it is Conflagration Day. Remember conflagrations in days of yore, such as the burning of Rome, the firestorms of Dresden, and the Great Chicago Fire. It is customary to gather all tinder materials into a pile, and to set it alight using accelerants as needed. In the evening, wondrous delights await as constables gather criminals from the county and fasten to them masks of turpentine and magnesium-treated papier-mâché. They are then bound together with a thick rope, which is set alight by the selected alderman. See how they try to escape, but as they struggle, the bonds become even more secure. Their heads alight, the screams of agony echo in the night, a soothing lullaby to the innocent, who feast on hot cinnamon cotton candy and sweet phosphates. April 21st, Tooth Day. In 1342, Viscount Cliff Nestergorg engaged in a 32-hour game of poker. A variant of the game, called Obdior Dwidzitu Zebau, was invented when the players had run out of coins. 20-tooth pickup involved the players removing teeth to be used in lieu of money. The winner of the game then got the prize of the tooth pool, the Pula Zibo, which the winner, Viscount Nestergorg, then put into his mouth while the dazed and toothless losers stared, mouths agape, empty and bloody. Cliff later died of gangrene infection. However, he is remembered to this day for his winning smile and hideous visage. May 12th, erection of Temple of Ploveb, 1919. It was on the 12th of May, 1919, when adherents of the cult of Ploveb broke ground on the first temple built in their honor. The building schematics were revealed to Alfonso Ionelli in 1917 in an ecstatic state, which he hastily set down and delivered to his fellow architectural acolytes. Among those exposed to the initial sketches were Frank Lloyd Wright, who promptly fainted out of fear. When he regained consciousness, he implored Ionelli to destroy the plans, as they were, quote, so unnatural that they would cause a riot to break out, unquote. A heated argument occurred, with Alfonso storming out of the hall. Ionelli was then accosted by representatives of the cult of Ploveb, who paid Ionelli $50 for the plans. The series of stacked spirals, which are arranged so as to give the illusion of there only being one side, was built in a remote valley in northern Wisconsin in 1919, completed in 1921. It stood there for over 30 years until a meteor shower in 1953 reduced the structure to rubble. The obsidian ruins still remain, and wildlife in the area is said to be highly intelligent and possess a strain of rabies taking the form of an iridescent purple fungus on their bodies. And now newsworthy items of interest from around the region. Sentient East Wars rage on for 3rd century. The battle today in Olath raged on, carrying over from the previous month in Lenexa. The communist FY 1679 front continues to advance against the fascist and devious FY 4 battalion, with signs that perhaps they can overtake them. This skirmish marks the 300th year that the East Wars have gone on in the western half of the United States. Currently, the states of Utah, Wyoming, and South Dakota are under nefarious FY 4 control, with the heroic FY 1679 maintaining their control of the western coast states. General Matamato of the FY 1679, in a press conference, indicated Canadian strains W303 and G833-1B will be called in to help secure the states of Kansas and Nebraska. Brigadier Sergeant Cerevisier of the FY4 impudently mocked the FY 1679 troops and declared that they would make, quote, a libation or bread unpalatable to any higher species, end quote. Scientists of the FY4 have been working on a plan to infiltrate the nervous systems of mammalian bipeds in an effort to accelerate their domination plans.
The creak of sunrise. Sunrise was accompanied by an audible creak which echoed across the sky. Blooming from the star was a writhing mass of vanta-black apertures which could be considered mouths if the main shape could be said to have a face. The seas boiled and cooked fish from minnows to humpback whales, rising to the surface, steaming. Any mammal or reptile between the 65th north and south parallels was instantly turned into a blackened crisp. Sentient beings which were not cooked by the looming entity, making its way closer to the planet at thousands of miles per hour, went mad. Many committed suicide. Some just sat in corners and gibbered until they died of exhaustion, heat, and dehydration. The entity now eclipsed the sun and began to separate like a running egg. The light diffused through its iridescent chemtrails made the sky appear at once ochre, brown, blue, and white. Arctic volcanoes dormant for millennia erupted outside of northern Canadian cities, burying the insane denizens under tons of ash and molten lava. Only about 50 cities of any size around the world were spared as the entity breached the atmosphere. The thousands of still functioning human societies buried themselves underground in vast city-states, while enclaves of less civilized populations began to worship and attempt to appease the things now descending through the skies. The amorphous, squealing things squalled, falling with wet slaps on the ground, sizzling and undulating as though filled with snakes. The ground fissured where they fell, choking gases unnatural rose, suffocating and asphyxiating any unlucky enough to be near. Earthquakes shook the mantle, effectively entombing those who sought refuge underground from the invading onslaught. Humanity in a half-dozen months was eradicated. Years passed, and all life on the surface of the planet was reduced to hardy cacti, which could survive on the little polluted water which occasionally drizzled down, as well as the insects, the new lords of the planet. They fed on the tarp-like remnants of the black things, and within them birthed new intelligence, which crept and waited.
The Agonies of Noburanzia Motunides by Michael Cavagnaro. Noburanzia Motunides, in eulogy of her name and household, had made it a custom at the sounding of the third bell each morning to cast herself from the parapet of her tower down into the churn of the Doberan Sea. Her half-buponig adjunct Chuix was not at all reconciled to this practice. "My lady, thou art desolate, and none could thee blame, but ye shall neither be lost nor saved through water, therefore let us approach this day from another purview." No words could ever dissuade her. and invariably the surging waves and cruel rocks below would return a ruined and inert ragdoll to shore. But a curse placed upon Noburanzia by her husband, however well-intentioned, meant that life clung zealously to her, despite a fervent and desperate wish otherwise. Soon enough, Chuix himself acquiesced to melancholy and accompanied Noburanzia in her ritual. His body was never recovered. As a result, the ruins of Citadel Motunides gained another phantom, and after that only a few mindless servants remained to sift and claim the leavings of the sea. In discarnate form, Chuix lost none of his esteem for his mistress. Bereft of his own physical requirements, he was more tiresome than ever, fussing over the minutiae of Noburanzia's accoutrement and nutrition. Acutely unwell, Noburanzia had scant interest in those things, and instead ruminated ceaselessly over outwardly groundless conjecture in regard to her origins. Knowest thee not, Chuix, that my husband or his father hath long ago perfected a technique whereby he might over time gestate the idea stuff of his mind into a wholly distinct being? Verily, madam, thou hast stated this many times, not excluding mere moments ago when last ye spoke. It is curious. I have few recollections of Pokulaghof, land of my birth, nor hath any fellow countryman or blood relatives e'er darkened the gates of this citadel. While I lack full understanding, lady, I shall concede that thou art convinced of this. And hear this. My father Eunantius bedevils me as well, in a manner and means not unlike to thine own torment. I fear, Chuix, that this is but another deception, which my long-absent husband hath arranged to unknown purpose. At the mention of Eunantius, a peculiar draught grazed the flocked coat of his numinous flesh, yet Chuix suffered no chill. It was true that the silent and taciturn apparition, which regularly positioned itself at the fringes of Noburanzia's perception, did to a degree resemble her memories of Eunantius of Pokulaghof, excepting, of course, for its corpulent obesity, as her father had ever been of lean and pallid stock. Now, try as she might, Noburanzia Motunides could find little evidence of her own existence at the citadel prior to her espousal. Before long, Chuix's discovery of a trove of discarded children's storybooks in a forgotten credenza proved conclusively that Pokulaghof existed only in tales. And so, when the erstwhile spirit of Eunantius ultimately emerged from the gloom to parley, the scales fell from her eyes, and Noburanzia, no fool she, beheld the truth entire. Just as ye were formed of a seed from within mine own intellect, likewise has thine own germ engendered its fruit, spake her husband in exultation. Therefore surrender no more to thine angst and dolour. Only a few additional deeds remain before I may be restored to fullness. With the assistance of those mindless servants which endured, Noburanzia obtained from the citadel stores a number of weights and fetters of adamant solidity, which could withstand the rigors of briny and brackish water. She chose well her spot, and plunged herself from the tower to deepest Oberon, where for a millennium she was perpetually drowned and invigorated. Staunch, yet increasingly immaterial, Chuix stood guard upon the sea-coast until that distant day when the husband of Noburanzia Motunides, having reconstituted himself through alternate and vastly more labyrinthine means, appeared at his side. With a rueful chuckle, he gathered those residual energies which comprised Chuix and secured them within a pocket vessel. Noburanzia, spake the returned adept, and upon this summons her sodden and waterlogged but not altogether lifeless remains emerged from the depths. I hold thee blameless. Thou art released without debt. Whether to the Pokulaghof of legend, or some equivalent haven in the megacosm, he knew not, but Noburanzia Motunides was thereafter free. And now from Old Wyethscope's quarterly concern, trivia and facts. Impress your friends and family with these true nuggets of knowledge. There is a pit, Zagara Isen Ulu Sukru, in modern-day Turkey, which serves as a common gravesite for surrounding towns and villages. For thousands of years, bodies have been tossed into the pit with no signs of it filling. At a regular interval of every 24 days, a thick black smoke erupts from the hole, smelling of barbecue and frankincense. And now I bid you a restless night. May you cower in the corner until morning's light. And in the harsh daylight you will see no one really gets out of jail free. Thank you for listening to the Get Out of Jail Free Radio Hour. The Get Out of Jail Free Radio Hour was written, produced, edited, and uploaded by Matt Henshaw, except as indicated.